can also see my screen. Okay, so my name is Carson McKinstry. Doing this probably 9 months or so. One of the things that I learned early on was to actually use a language called Sass. They sort of champion themselves as the world's most powerful CSS preprocessor. So talk a little bit about that to begin. So CSS, if you don't already know, is cascading style sheets. So that's everything that we use, the language that we use to actually make things look pretty on the page. And Sass stands for syntactically awesome style sheets. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And then SCSS, it's a sort of offshoot of Sass. That's what we use for, stands for Sassy CSS, and it's a little bit closer to what we are used to. So I think that if you want to be a front-end developer, you have to know Sass. There's a lot of job postings out there that I see they say, we use Sass, we use less, we use some sort of preprocessor. And if you didn't know already, preprocessors are sort of an abstraction layer on top of what we already have. And it compiles down to it. So it takes our syntax and turns it into something else. So a couple of the big reasons why you need it. So there are a lot of companies and a lot of frameworks that use it. It saves you time and energy. I'll show you why here in a second. And then it allows you to actually write cleaner and drier code. So there are two syntaxes. So on the left, we have our SCSS syntax. It looks really similar to our normal CSS. And then we have on the left, on the right, we have the Sass syntax. So this is actually uses the idea of syntactically significant white space. So every tab you have is actually the compiler actually understands what that is. So one of the biggest features of Sass is actually what's known as nesting. So I've got two examples of nesting here. So the top one where it says warning and then big. Actually, let me show you an example of what we'll be building. So this is what we'll be building. Well, what I'll show you how I built it. So you've got this big warning message and then a button that hovers and those fancy things. So back to the code. So on the left, like I said, is the SCSS syntax, and on the right is the Sass syntax. So you notice here we have a warning. That's the overarching class for whatever we're talking about. And then this is a child element within your HTML file. So on the outside, we've got that warning, a paragraph with a warning class. On the inside, we've got a span with the big class. Below that, we have the base for the button. So we have the button main class, so .btn, and then on the inside of that, we've got that .btn submit. So if you notice at the beginning of the button submit line, you've got an ampersand. That just signifies that the class is a sibling class to whatever you're talking about, or to whatever element you're looking at. The same also applies for pseudo classes, so like this hover class. So that's how you get those fancy hover animations. The next thing is variables. So this is one of my favorite parts of CSS or of Sass. It allows you to anything that you can think of to store in a variable, you can store in a variable. So here I have my font stack, and I've got a couple colors. So here's a green color and here's a dark green color. Those were not supposed to be those. And so we use them within the CSS like this, or the Sass like this. So you've got background color, and then you've got the variable name reference there. It's the same in the Sass syntax. Next, we have Mixins. So this is another really, really cool feature that looks really complicated at first. But one of the things that Mixins do is that allows you to create functions within your CSS. So here we have two really common functions. So in CSS, one of the things you have to do for certain properties, they have to be prefixed. Otherwise, they won't work on certain browsers. So one of the things you can do with Mixins is actually break that out and make it usable anywhere you need it. So we've got this box shadow. So it takes the X offset, Y offset, the blur, and the color. And then we also have the translate function, the transform and then translate. Looks like I misspelled that. Whoops. And it takes the X and Y offset again. So you include them in your SCSS or Sass. So you've got this include statement. And then you put the name of the mixin and then your parameters. And then same, or your arguments, pardon me. And same thing over here, there's just a little bit of slight difference. So instead of using this fancy @mixin keyword, we actually use an equal sign at the beginning of a mixin. And then we include it with a plus sign. So then extends. So one of the big things in Sass is you can actually, you have this ability to write a little code, but then it compiles to a lot of it. So we added in a thing called extending. The convention is to use an extend over a mixin if you don't have anything that changes within the extend. If that makes sense. So here we have a message. And it's prefixed with a %sign. That's just the normal thing to do. And then under there, we have this .submit. So say this message is supposed to apply to a bunch of different things, but not necessarily the same exact thing every single time. We use the @extend, and then message, and it'll actually compile and add this into our class. It's the same syntax for Sass, just without the curly brackets. We can also do math with SCSS and Sass. The biggest thing for this, so right here we have this width. So what that'll do is it'll actually compile down to somewhere around 66% of the total width of whatever you're looking at. And it's the same over here. So it's actually how things like the Bootstrap grid is created. And I think it's the same as some of the grids in the other major frameworks. So one of the last things, and this is actually what keeps your code dry, are partials. So there are lots of other languages out there that actually use partials. And these are just little snippets of code that are only in one file, and you actually import them into another. It's really important that the partials are actually prefaced with an underscore in the file name, because that's what the Sass compiler actually looks for to find the files. So the example I have here, so we say we've got this reset file that you want to use across a bunch of different programs, but you don't want to rewrite it every single time. So you put all your main styles in there, and then you import it into the main file. So here we've got the syntax for both of them. So for SCSS requires the single quotes and a semicolon, and then the Sass syntax doesn't. And this right here is the path to your file. So there's a lot of other features with Sass. Those are the ones that are the most used, everyone sort of sees them. These are some of the other ones that you can actually do. So we've got control directives. So you've got the for loops, while loops, each loops, and then if statements. You can also nest media queries within whatever style you're looking at within the class. And then there's a lot more that you can actually find. So the last thing we have to talk about is actually compiling it. So there's two different ways to actually compile your Sass files. So you've got the main one, which is just running at a single time. So that's Sass, main.sass, and then main.css. So this is your input file right there. Oops. And then this is your output file. And it will actually pick up both languages. So it'll actually pick up Sass, and it'll also pick up SCSS. And then you can also have it continually watch. So what that means is every time it sees that a change has been made to one of the files, it will recompile it for you. So that's done with that -w tag. One thing to note is it does require Ruby on your computer. So there's a lot of Windows computers that have some issues with actually downloading and installing using Ruby. So a wonderful developer actually created a node package called node Sass that'll actually handle that for you. So it doesn't use Ruby, instead it uses JavaScript to do it. So I'll actually show off that now. So in this file, so we see I've got a, oops, get rid of all these unneeded. So here we have a main.sas file and a main.scss file. So the way that we actually are going to do that, or the way we're actually going to compile it is, so sass main.sass main.css. It'll give you it won't give you a good message, and that's just talking about like Ruby libraries being out of date. But now if we look at that again, we've now got a main.css file. I'll show you what both of those look like. We'll go over to Atom. So here is my main.sas file. So we're importing the partials. So in my partials folder over here, I've got my mixins declared, and I've got my variables declared. And then those are pulled into it, into the main file. So here we have my font stack that's being imported or being used. So we've got the font stack here again. And then we've got my background color for my buttons. So that's going to be blue, and then we've also got this dark blue color being used. And then here are the mixins that are being used. And then down here below, we've got my extended class. So now, the one thing that this doesn't do is it doesn't actually output really clean code. If you look at it, it's really it looks a little weird. I'll actually show you here in a second, right here. So you notice that it actually indents, but in fact it's not actually indenting. Got that closed bracket. But this is what would go to the front end whenever you actually compile it. This will go to the front end, and this is what your web page will use. So lastly, I will show you, so where do we go next from here? So now that you've got sort of an intro to Sass, now what? So the sasslang.com is their website. I would definitely recommend checking it out. They've got some really good resources there. And they also have a quick start guide. So this is sasslang.com /guide. So that'll have a lot of the information I've given you today, but it'll go into it a little more in depth. This third one, so we've got sassyway.com. So they've got a lot of tutorials on actually how to use Sass and what to do with it. And then finally, we've got the documentation. So the documentation goes into a lot more detail about everything I've talked about today, along with all the other directives that they've got and a lot of the other features that they've got. Yeah, so I'll show you one last time what that outputs. We'll reload this page. So if you see here, we've got this big warning message, and then we've got a button that hovers. So it's not too out there, or it's not too interesting at the moment, but this can create really large, really interesting pages. Yeah, I think that's it. That's all I've really got. So next, I believe, is Chris. He's going to be talking about, what are you talking about again?